Howdy SMITE fans, it's J-Mac. I'm back here again, and that means that we got something special that must have happened. We had our SPL play-in tournament take place this past week. We've already had 6 of our Pro League teams revealed, and this tournament was going to determine who our last 2 teams were going to be. So, let's take a look back and see what teams ended up making it in this week's edition of the SPL Weekly Recap. Now, before I go on and talk about the 2 teams that did make it to the SPL, let's talk about the 8 other teams real briefly that did not end up making it through. Starting off, we had our 2 EU teams with Just F6 and Thunderhead. Despite these teams not being super familiar with the NA style of play, they were able to make solid adaptations and improvements throughout the entirety of the weekend. And I look forward to seeing what these guys can do in the upcoming weeks of the SCC. Next up are Reverse Card and the Neighborhood. Both of these teams had to make last-minute roster changes and role swaps for this event, but they were still able to come out and perform at an astonishing level. I was impressed with how quickly they were able to make adjustments on the fly, and they should be strong contenders should these teams qualify towards the SCC. Moving on towards Samsara and Nobody's Favorites, we saw some innovative gameplay from these teams throughout their sets. Given more time together, I'm sure that these teams can pose a real threat to the competition with the tenure of the players that were on these teams. Impressive play across the board, though, nonetheless, from these squads. And finally, the Duck Club and Fun Havers, 2 teams that mightily impressed this event. These teams boasted some new and old talent and had a lot to prove this tournament. They continue to shine even through their low points, and they give us high hopes for the year to come with our level of amateur talent out there. Which leaves us with now our 2 teams that did qualify into the SPL, the Oni Homies and the Winter Dogs. Let's go ahead and start by talking about the Oni Homies first and going all the way back to their very first set of the week up against Samsara. It all started back on day number 2. Game 1, Samsara had complete control in just about every team fight, but the Homies were more concerned with the PvE aspect of the game. All game long, the Homies held the gold and experience lead, and with just 1 Fire Giant team fight, the Homies are able to take away game 1. For game number 2, the Homies cleaned up their fighting, and Samsara, even despite working on their farm, it wasn't enough for them to stop the veteranship of the Homies, and they overcame Samsara, and it's the Homies who move on in the upper bracket with a 2-0 win. Well, it's day number 3, and the second set for the Oni Homies in this bracket is up against the Fun Havers. Game number 1 started with a level 1 gank in the duo lane by Uzi. And that duo lane momentum kick-started the pacing for the Fun Havers, and the Homies just couldn't catch up. The lead spiraled out of control, and the Fun Havers were able to take game number 1. Game number 2, it was again duo pressure that would solidify an early lead, but the Fun Havers were nowhere to be found. When the Homies showed up to an empty duo lane, they hit the ground running and never looked back. And the Homies take a clean game 2 to tie up the set. And in game number 3, Nika unleashed his wrath upon the entire Fun Havers team. They had a Gold Fury fight. Nika and the Homies thwart the Fun Havers plans of the Fury, and Nika slams out our first competitive pentakill of Season 9. And from there, the Homies are able to take game number 3 and take the set 2-1. And now the only thing standing between the Oni Homies and reclaiming their spot in the SPL is the Winter Dogs. Game number 1 opens up slowly, drafting a comp that would hard camp the mid lane. And the Homies kept Benny Q and the rest of the team at bay, and were able to steadily take game number 1. Game 2, though, was a real treat for everyone as Benny goes back to his signature raw pick from earlier on this week, and between Benny Q and Wowie, no lives were spared, and the Winter Dogs wrangled in a win for game number 2. Game 3 was back and forth all game long. The Homies would start with a big lead, and then the Winter Dogs would close that gap. And this would go on for nearly 40 minutes of play. However, in just a couple of late game team fights, the Winter Dogs continued to expend one too many resources to kill Nika, allowing the Homies to collapse in on the Winter Dogs. And after 45 minutes of this tightrope walk, it's the Oni Homies who wipe out the Winter Dogs at the Fire Giant and end game 3. Game number 4 was run by the Oni Homies for just about the entirety of the game. In an impatient attempt to end the game, Benny Q and Wowie managed to hold off the Oni Homies for their greedy play. But it was just a delay of the inevitable, as one team fight later, Nika walks past the Winter Dogs and storms the Titan room to close out the game, take the set, and once again reclaim their title as the Oni Warriors as they qualify to the SPL. Now, that just leaves the Winter Dogs. Let's take a look at their path. It all started back on day number 2 with their first match up against nobody's favorites. Game number 1 started out fairly close, but a split fight and nobody's favorites Obelisk goes south, and the Dogs are able to clean up 2 kills for none. And then, as the game progressed and we moved in, one bad fight at the solo lane tier 2 tower lines up a perfect double snipe for BennyQ, and the Winter Dogs are able to close out game number 1. Game number 2 started off almost as poorly as game 1 did for the favorites, as they force a bad fight over at the red buff early on, and that pushed the Dogs heavily into the lead. From there, the Winter Dogs slowly bled out the competition and closed out their set with a 2-0 victory. And the next matchup in the bracket for the Winter Dogs was up against the Duck Club. Game 1 was a slow start until Kirmi pulls off a phenomenal double kill in a fight around the mid camps. And although Duck Club were able to recuperate some of their losses during that fight, the Winter Dogs controlled every objective until the Duck Club simply could not step up anymore. BennyQ and Kirmi lead the charge to seal away game number 1 for the Winter Dogs. In game number 2, right out the gates, the front line of the Winter Dogs pull up big. Duck Club tried to get back in the game with an 18-minute Gold Fury, but the Winter Dogs instead decide to sneak away a Fire Giant at the exact same time. And with that crushing objective overlap, the Winter Dogs methodically dismantle the last of Duck Club's structures, Phoenixes, and then they end out the series 2-0. Now, I would go on about the third set here for the Winter Dogs, but that was the set that I just covered between them and the Yomi Homies. So instead, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next match beyond there, which is the final promotional match for the SPL. And once again, it's a rematch here, up against the Duck Club. Game 1 was dual lane aggression from minute 1. The Winter Dogs barrel stuffed the Duck Club dual lane, and that lead bled in towards the mid and the jungle. And then the lead explodes out of control, and in one final brawl in the mid lane, after a Winter Dogs Fire Giant, they're able to end the game, and the Winter Dogs come out on top for game number 1. Game 2 looked like it was going to start off strong for the Ducks, but once again, the dual lane just showing utter dominance. Even with the 3 kills that Luconium was able to amount, nobody else on the Ducks could deal with Gamma and the rest of the Winter Dogs' lead. And an ever-waning Ducks team falling behind, the Dogs were able to wrestle game number 2 away. And in game number 3, it was a case of third verse, same as the second. Look, I know it doesn't rhyme, but basically you can kind of just put game 3 on repeat here. Gamma leading the charge with Kirmi right behind him, and the Winter Dogs, after a long, tenuous grind over in the SCC for a year straight, will finally clinch their spot in the SPL as your new Valhalla Valkyries team. And there you have it. The Oni Homies and the Winter Dogs are your 2 teams to qualify to the SPL as the Oni Warriors and the Valhalla Valkyries respectively. Now, it'll be a little bit of time before we actually do see these teams compete with the remainder of the SMITEPro League. Be sure to keep your eyes out on our SMITEPro Twitter and the SMITEPro League website for more information as to when that league is going to be starting up. But until then, I'd like to thank you guys for tuning in and stopping by. This has been JMac with the SPL Weekly Recap, signing off.